Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Ahmed Moor, a non-resident fellow at the Foundation, and today is May 1st. Happy May Day, Ben. And I'm
Happy May
delighted
Day.
to be here with Ben Ehrenreich, an author and a journalist who recently wrote two big stories, either of which would have been great to talk about alone in The Nation and in Harper's. But I mean, to have two big essays come out so close to one another I think is remarkable in terms of output, and I'm eager to talk to you about both. So thanks again for joining me today, Ben, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Ahmed. It's great to be here.
So Ben, when I first read the Nation essay, which we'll link to when we post the podcast, I searched in my email inbox to see if we had corresponded in the past because I was looking for your email. And I found something you wrote in the LA Times back in 2009, and it was called Zionism is the Problem. And when I read this, I got very excited and emailed it to a bunch of friends and other people. And it was really kind of a courageous piece of writing, especially for that time. Um, and and I guess the point I want to highlight is that you've been involved in this topic for a long time. So before I get into Zionism is the Problem, which is the title of the piece that appeared back in 2009 in the LA Times. Would you just provide kind of an overview of how you became involved in Palestine, Israel?
Uh, yeah, I guess. I mean, at that point, that piece was my the first time I dipped my toe into what I didn't realize was going to be a very hot bath, um, foolishly, perhaps. I was working. I was living in LA. Had been writing for LA Weekly and for a bunch of other magazines, and I guess what got me involved then was the war, the Gaza War of 2008, 2009, which at the time, um, I mean, now it's like a weekend's worth of bombings. Um, but at the time, it seemed like an abomination. It just seemed like um, just a moral outrage that this extraordinarily well-equipped military power with U.S. weaponry, U.S. weapon and U.S. support was, bombing a captive population in a tiny area from which they could not leave, and that it is still a moral abomination. But I think that war um, was what really brought Palestine to my consciousness, and maybe it should have been there earlier. But I think that's what first got me involved. And That piece was it was an op-ed piece, and I foolishly didn't think it was going to be that controversial, um, because my father's family is Jewish. We were not Zionists. My grandparents were not Zionists. They had no interest in the state of Israel. It was not a part of our Jewish heritage at all. Um, and I'd done enough reading to learn to know that this was not unique. I mean, I think most American Jews do grow up with a strong connection to Israel, but a lot don't, and particularly Jews on the left. And Until the 60s, after the 67 war, those ties were not particularly strong. Um, and until after the state of Israel was founded in 1948, there was a great deal of opposition to Zionism among mainstream American Jews. So I wrote this piece, arguing, just sort of laying out some of this history, that there was a strong anti-Zionist tradition among 20th century American Jews. And I think I'm glad that the Zionism is the Problem is the headline that it came down with, because when it was printed, and in those days people still read the paper in paper form more often than not. It was printed as the bottom half of two pieces. The top piece was given to a quite dogmatic Zionist. I mean, I had pitched the piece. They found a Zionist to provide the counterpoint. They put him at the top of the page, and the headline they put across both pieces was, "Is anti-Zionism hate?"
Wow.
So that was my introduction to the topic, and I think in the editing process of that piece, I was shocked at how much now I'd have no problem calling it censorship, but it was censorship under the guise of copy edit of meeting the house style, right? There were words you weren't allowed to say apartheid. You
Right.
could see that with regard to South Africa, but sorry, can't say that about Israel. Some of these things have changed a little, but not much. Um, and I didn't travel to the region for work until 2011. And I did actually, it was, yeah, 2011. I did the first piece, an earlier piece for Harper's on the role of water in the occupation. And, um, and as much as I thought I knew, as much research as I'd done beforehand, as much as I thought I knew about the situation, being in the West Bank was, what you call it an eye opener is an understatement. I think a lot of people have had this experience. You think you're ready, you think you know a lot about it, you've read all the books, you've read all the articles, and then you go there and the starkness not only of the inequality, but of the violence um, that is literally inscribed in the earth, which enforces that inequality, is just mind blowing. Um,
Yeah.
and
And I'm eager to get into that because that's the substance of the Harper's essay, which of course we'll link to as well. And it would be interesting, I guess, to understand your experience at a remove, I guess 2011 to 2025. But I do want to read from Zionism is the Problem, and just to highlight how groundbreaking this was in 2009, coming on the heels of Cast Lead, which you highlighted as just a shocking assault at that time on the residents of Gaza. I think there were 1,400 people killed, which is, you said, is like a weekend's worth of massacres at this point. Um, but you wrote the deplorable conditions in which Palestinians live and die in Gaza and the West Bank came as the result of specific policies, leaders, or parties on either side of the impasse. That was the idea initially. The problem is fundamental. Founding a modern state on a single ethnic or religious identity in a territory that is ethnically and religiously diverse leads inexorably either to politics of exclusion, think of the 139 square mile prison camp that Gaza has become, or to wholesale ethnic cleansing. Put simply, the problem is Zionism. I mean, this is prescient writing. This is, I regret, and I think probably lots of listeners regret that what you wrote here has come to pass. The writing has been on the wall for a long time. And so I guess, how do you reflect on this today?
it makes me very sad to hear those words. I think that there's as bad as we all knew it was then, um, and as realistic as we thought our expectations were, then what's occurred over the last 16 months, is it now? 17 months,
Yeah.
um, is nonetheless um, you can see what this was going to happen, right? It's very easy to see this, and at the time it was easy to see this as a possibility, but at the time there were many other possibilities too. There were possibilities that did not involve the killing of at least 50,000 and probably far more people. That did not involve the hobbling of an entire generation. That did not involve such like absolute and utter destruction, genocidal violence, right? I mean, there was a genocidal logic in place, but there were a lot of other ways this could have gone, and it didn't go those ways. And I think it is beyond sad. It's beyond maddening to know how many people were complicit in it going this way. And I'm not just talking about the Israeli military. I'm not just talking about Israeli government or society. I'm talking not just talking about the U.S. government, but I'm talking about institution after institution in the West, both in the U.S. and in Europe, which have done everything that they could to appease and protect Israel all along the way, even now, with massacres every day, but that now we barely hear about anymore. But that knowing how bloody their hands are, they just keep on washing them and pretending they're clean. Uh,
And so, I mean, with a focus, I'm 100% with you here, with a focus on the institutions that you've worked within, publishing institutions. Is that you described some of the house style as a censorious tool, for instance? Is that because editors were ignorant and this is a frightening issue that you don't want to touch for career risk, or is that uh, frankly a conspiracy of affinity, um, where Israel's given the benefit of the doubt, because it's Western and like us and so on. So how do you perceive those differences? I mean, in my experience, I've written for smaller papers here in the U.S. and I've met editors who are really focused on domestic issues, and this is just one of those things that you kind of defer to others about. You don't want to use the word apartheid. You're not really qualified to understand what that means. And by the way, you're taking risk for even going there.
yeah. Yeah, I think it's both. Um, I mean, I think there are a lot of the majority. I think are take that latter stand. They don't really want to. Nobody wants to risk their career over something they don't know that much about. They know that this is a touchy issue. They're going to defer to their superiors. They're going to defer to people who they think probably know more than they do. But there are people who know more than they do. That all of the major papers have correspondents. Most of them live in Tel Aviv. A few of them live in Jerusalem. None of them live in the West Bank. None of them live in Gaza. None of them even go to Gaza anymore. Few of them even go to the West Bank anymore. And those people know better. Um, and they are engaged, I think, in for the most part, a very conscious propaganda effort. That is, and this Palestine is not entirely unique in this. There are other areas of the world in which the American media does play the same kind of propaganda role. If you try to write about Cuba in certain ways, you will find it's impossible. I think the sort of traditional enemies, the old enemies of American foreign policy, of American empire, um, are untouchable, right? You could not write you could not have written in American outlets a work that humanized, much less was sympathetic with the Iraqi resistance during the occupation of Iraq. Although in retrospect, it's quite easy to sympathize with that, with the resistance. Um, but yeah, and Israel Palestine has been one of these issues that this is one of these imperial red lines. And I think the kind of one painful thing is that in the last few years, we made progress. It was easier than ever to get Palestinian voices into mainstream media. I mean, we've seen the limits of this since October 7th of 2023, but it was better than it ever had been. Even the fact of my work being published by a major publisher, my work ending up in the New York Times Magazine, the idea of someone with my politics being allowed to comment on the occupation would have been impossible 10 years earlier. So we'd made all of this progress, and then suddenly, with October 7th, like it was suddenly clear how meaningless it all was, and all of the gates came down heavier than ever.
And how do you evaluate that, the kind of coarsening of the environment, the gates coming down, the censorship, the brutalization of people who speak up, physically, they're being protesters are being attacked by police in the streets and so on. But also the pervasive censorship in media. Um, how do you, is this kind of the last gasp of empire? Is this, that's a big statement, but is it just, are we seeing things the way they are, or is this or is this a lashing out of something which is on its way out?
Um, I mean, I think we're seeing things the way they are. I mean, I think a lot of masks have been lifted in the last couple of years, and some very ugly truths and ugly realities revealed. Um, I think, I mean, I think the one thing that is clearly over, and that ended on October 7th, was a certain um, self-satisfaction that liberal empire allowed itself, a certain smugness that liberal empire allowed itself. That we could sit in the metropole in our coffee shops in DC or New York or London or Los Angeles and feel pretty good about all of the rights that we had and we were helping to bring to the rest of the world, and the rules-based order and all sorts of things like that. And then the second there was a challenge to that, a serious challenge to that, which came about on October 7th, all facades disappeared. And we saw this like brutal act of colonial disciplining, which continues to this day, um, and its domestic counterparts. Complete disregard for First Amendment rights in the U.S., and this was true before Donald Trump took office, um, and both in the media and in the streets, um, brutalization of protesters, um, and yeah, I think. Um, the um, we saw exactly how far the sort of friendly face of empire um, goes, and it's not that far.
Right.
It's not that.
And I think that's a great transition to the nation piece, which you probably anticipated. I mean, the title here is "You Don't Get Trump Without Gaza," and so I was the subject of a little bit of you know negative attention, I guess, over saying pretty openly, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden. And I think I'm pretty representative in lots of ways of other Palestinian Americans and Arab Americans of different stripes, who are often conflated with Muslim Americans. But I think, Christian Americans, Chaldeans, whatever, I'm sorry, Christian Arabs in America, um, nobody was very enthusiastic about Israel's destruction of Lebanon, Shia, Sunni, or Christian. So, anyways, it's this community which decided we're not too excited about the Democrats. And I feel that a lot of that has been vindicated with some of the drop site news reporting that emerged recently, indicating that there was really no interest or push for a ceasefire. You put it really well, colonial disciplining going on. Um, so what do you argue here in the essay? What is the central insight? You trace this continuity between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. How is somebody who lives in this country supposed to treat that information? What do we do with it?
Um, yeah, it's I'm not sure how to answer that part of the question.
Sure.
You know, the first 102 days now of the Trump administration have been like horrific in a lot of ways, many of them expected, some of them like worse than we thought. Um, and there's all this chest beating, hair pulling, et cetera, in the liberal media, about fascism, about authoritarianism, et cetera, as if this came from nowhere. And I mean, those of us who pay attention to Palestine, like, have seen just this massive crackdown on First Amendment rights, um, McCarthyite blacklisting, on the one hand, to like thuggish physical assaults on the other, um, like across the board since October 7th. And this puts the what we've seen under Trump in a different light, right? I mean, this like there seems to be quite a bit of continuity between the way people who spoke out for Palestine were dealt with under Biden, and there is certainly a great deal of stepping up with the disappearing and deportations of activists, Palestinian and not, since really in the last 2 months, right? Um, but uh, but I don't think we can allow ourselves the illusion that this all arrived with Trump, and that there were no fascist impulses or authoritarian impulses, if the word fascism makes you nervous, um, that existed like within the democratic establishment, and within what broadly is called the center of American politics. Um, and that center was not only just fine with the repression of Palestinian voices and of all voices in solidarity with Palestine, but was an active participant in it. I mean, it was pushing for it. Um, so what do we do with this? Where do we go? I'm not sure, because I mean one of the things that was so extraordinarily painful to watch since October 7th was just the corruption of institution after institution, cultural institutions, educational institutions, media institutions, political institutions. All of them were doing everything they could to cover for a genocide, and to make sure that it would be allowed to continue without any bumps. Um, and then we are supposed to say, okay, but now we're all going to hold hands with the people who are doing this, to fight fascism.
I mean, if
Uh,
you'll allow me, I'm 100%. I'm going to read from the essay. I mean, you write the brutal silencing, manipulative dishonesty, McCarthyite pettiness, thuggish illiberalism, and general censorial repressiveness that liberal pundits currently associate with Trumpism have been rampant in the U.S. since just after October 7th, 2023, when it became clear that Israel's response to Hamas's attack would not be merely disproportionate, but exterminatory in scope and intent. And I mean, you're exactly right there. You highlight the institutional circling of the wagons here. Harvard now is getting lots of plaudits in other kind of mainstream institutionalized media, for quote standing up to Trump, but in fact they've implemented the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. They've cracked down just as forcefully as anywhere else has. Hillary Rodham and others have been forced out of positions of scholarship and authority at that place at Harvard. And so, what is this sleight of hand here? Because now we're being told that these very same actors are the vanguard of a resistance to authoritarianism. That seems confusing to me.
Yeah, it's confusing to me. And I think it's clear that if the crackdown on higher ed had remained at the level of you must purge all the Palestinians and those sympathize with them, whether it's people on student visas or postdocs or professors, then most of these institutions would have been fine with it and would have played along. I mean, we saw that happening already under Biden. We saw that happening when the presidents of prestigious universities were called to testify before Congress. They were willing to get on their knees and do what they had to do. But I think the Trump administration overplayed itself with Harvard, and Harvard was threatened enough to be fighting back. But like I don't think we should have any illusions about what that struggle means for them and who they're willing to cut loose from it. Um,
So, I mean, as an observer of American domestic political dynamics and institutions, and that's really, again, the thrust of the essay in some ways. Um, do you have any faith in the Reformation or the ability of these institutions to be reformed? And I'm talking electoral as well, the Democratic Party. Well, and it goes to my first question, which is perhaps a bit big and vague, but where do we go from here? What do we do with this? Are these institutions redeemable?
I don't know if redeemable is the word I'd look at, because I think politics is uh, always dirty, and always compromised. Um, you know, um, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar are also part of the Democratic Party, and have that is another gain that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago, right? The women as strong and radical as they are taking the positions with integrity that they're taking have stayed in office. So I think the fight has to be on all fronts all the time. And that I don't think that can mean like believing the Democratic Party is you know um, a corrupt institution which we should have nothing to do with. I think that there are that as much as candidates can be run who will change that institute, that party, like it has to happen. And I think there's a huge amount of, I mean, obviously there's a huge amount of money pushing against it, but there's a huge amount of, I think, popular momentum. I think people are absolutely horrified at the complicity of the Democratic establishment with the Trump administration. So I think there's a moment of crisis here in which a lot could happen. And but I think it's very important to um, remember who we're dealing with and remember what kind of ground we're on with them, and make sure that you know like no one's going to be fooled. I think at this point.
I mean, that kind of leads us to the next big essay that you wrote in Harper's, and it's devastating to read. After Nonviolence, one of the basic ideas, the essay presumes this relationship, this dynamic relationship between nonviolent resistance or action in Palestine, and then democratic action in the United States, the UK, perhaps other centers of influence and empire that could possibly impact Israeli actions on the ground there. And I'll get to the passage in a moment, but that relationship seems to have broken down, and it goes again to what we were just talking about, the way in which these democratic institutions are maybe ossified, maybe non-responsive to ordinary democratic inputs. Um, what did you find when you went to the West Bank? So you first went in 2011. Had you visited throughout, and then so what was that?
Yeah, I mean, I went for a few weeks in 2011 to work on that piece, and then I went back in the summer of 2012 to work on a different piece on the resistance in a village called Nabi um, and ended up going back for that same piece in early 2013. And a few months later, I moved there to work on a book and stayed there until um, after the 2014 war had ended in the fall of 2014. Um, and since then, I've been back a handful of times for stories and to visit. Um, but so I've kept in touch with folks over those years, and a lot of the people that I wrote about in the Harper's piece are people I've known, if not since 2011, since 2012 or 2013. Um, and I knew things were bad, but I think even knowing how much worse things have gotten, I was unprepared for the level of fear, I think, that has fallen over the West Bank in the last few months, the last, since October 7th, really. Um, and, you know, I was very familiar with how the occupation functions, was also familiar and like deeply moved, as I think a lot of like visitors to Palestine are, by the vivacity and passion of resistance that one finds pretty much everywhere. And to see this just profound level of depression and fear that had paralyzed people all over the West Bank was not something, it wasn't surprising, but it was nonetheless like impressive. That the most of the nonviolent resistance movement, as I knew it, has sort of been stopped in its tracks because the Israeli, you can't protest. You cannot have a public demonstration without getting shot with live ammunition. And that's not a new reality, but it's things have been um, it used to be that live ammunition came out, people were killed with live ammunition, but more than anything, there was tear gas and there were things like that, and people did die, but it wasn't quite as constant. And now people are just being targeted and killed, and people live in considerable fear, and fear not just because if they demonstrate they'll be shot at, but because every time they cross a checkpoint they might be shot. Because even if they don't cross a checkpoint, if they stay home, their villages may be raided, and the soldiers may decide to kill them. Or if it's not soldiers, it may be settlers who come, whose goal is to do whatever they can to push them out. And I think what's happened in Gaza has made it really clear to people in the West Bank how little the guarantees of the international community were worth, how little their protection is worth, and how little separates them from the realities that we're seeing in Gaza now. And so I was in the reporting for the Harper's piece took place in November. I was there for 3 weeks in November, and spent time in the north, in the parts of the West Bank where armed resistance has been a more or less constant reality for the last couple of years, in Jenin and Tulkarm in particular. And while I was there, things were quite bad. I spoke with resistance fighters, and they were living, as hunted men, basically, in the refugee camps. The camps had been repeatedly attacked, their infrastructure destroyed, streets bulldozed, water and electricity destroyed, homes, hit with drone strikes and air strikes. Since then, of course, and this was just, I guess it was in early January, so a month and a half after I left, the Jenin camp was emptied of residents. And
30,000 people.
yeah, and a few days later, the Tulkarm camp too. Um, so the kind of wholesale ethnic cleansing and displacement that we've seen in Gaza has already been brought to the West Bank.
So you're
And
right about the Gazification of the West Bank, and there are two elements to it, right? One is that you just highlighted that the guarantees that people seem to perceive that were in place, maybe by the Germans or the British or maybe even Americans had put in place, are worthless in the context of a genocide in Gaza. But second, I didn't think I was a naive person, but I also didn't think the Israelis would commit a genocide. I just didn't believe that that was possible. Um, and again, I didn't ascribe, very positive intentions or attributes to the Israeli leadership, the settlers, the right-wing Zionists or Zionists of any stripe, frankly. Um, and yet I'm shocked by it. So, to what extent is the fear that you saw um, described by a different perspective on Israelis versus, oh, in fact, we're really all on our own here, or maybe is it both?
I think it's both. I mean, like on the one hand, according to everyone I talked to, the day-to-day encounters with Israeli soldiers have changed dramatically.
Past year and a half.
What's that?
In the past year and a half.
Yeah. That, in the past, if soldiers raided your house, you could yell at them. You might get arrested. You might and probably would get beaten up. But people did not shy away from getting in the faces of armed soldiers and yelling at them. And now, people I know who are incredibly brave people, who have been to prison, who've been injured, et cetera, say like you can't. They're crazy now, and they will kill you over nothing. That their attitudes, that the Israeli soldiers since October 7th are operating in such a frenzy of both fear and vengeful fury, I think, that on an immediate level, every encounter with them is terrifying. Um, and of course, it's very difficult to avoid Israeli soldiers if you live in the West Bank. That particularly in the last, this has always been an issue, but since October 7th, the internal movement controls have been ratcheted up to an extraordinary degree, so that to travel a distance that should take 10 minutes routinely takes an hour and a half, 2 hours, because roads are closed, because checkpoints have been established, because checkpoints are established and then closed. So it's very hard to avoid them. So those are people's visible encounters with Israeli troops. The other part, which is less visible but is present in everyone's mind, is what happens in the prisons. Um, there's been a massive arrest campaign since October 7th. And the conditions in the prisons are, beyond horrific. People are starved. People are tortured. People are beaten. People are killed. Dozens have been killed in prisons, and it's been documented by human rights groups. Every time it's sort of excruciating to watch whenever Hamas releases a prisoner. The New York Times and all of the American media and the Israeli media and the Western media, scrutinizes their treatment and the behavior of crowds in Gaza over the releases, without giving any coverage to what's happening to Palestinians when they're released from prison, who routinely, and I don't, this is hard for me to even say, as someone from a Jewish background, the people come out looking like they've come out of like Auschwitz. They routinely have lost half their body weight. They're covered in bruises. Their eyes don't look right, because of what they've suffered and seen. And so I'm talking about people, some people who are friends of mine, who I saw there, who I saw images of them when they were released from prison, almost unrecognizable, looking like they had aged 30 years after a few months in prison. And people. So this reality is also sort of constantly in people's minds, because prison is you don't see it in the West Bank, but it is an invisible reality for everyone, because everybody knows someone or has somebody in their family who is in prison. And those absences are very, very present. So that works both as a source of great grief for people, but also for fear, because if you mess with a soldier and they decide to arrest you, it is in some cases worse than a death sentence. So there's that, and then, as you said, there's the knowledge that no one's coming to the rescue. Not the U.S. and not the Europeans. The only party that's really consistently tried have been the Houthis, right? Hezbollah made an effort that they had to abandon after Israel bombed Lebanon to a horrific degree. The other Arab countries have been, largely silent and absent. So people know they're on their own, and that's I think that's really excruciating for people.
Here, I think it's worth reading the from the Harper's essay. Over the past decade, sympathy for Palestinians in the United States has grown steadily, particularly among the young, while support for Israel has plummeted. And this is, you see that in the Pew data. But last year's campus demonstrations were almost everywhere repressed by the police, and the fact that a majority of Americans supported putting conditions on military aid to Israel found no reflection in either party's platform. And that's disheartening, right? What's the value of nonviolence? Nonviolence isn't a good unto itself, is it?
Um, yeah, I think um, one of the things, like, I felt uh, frequently foolish, traveling around the West Bank, to mainly with people I knew, and asking them about nonviolence. Like in the face of what's happening in Gaza, how can like it takes a lot of balls to come and ask people to be nonviolent. And but I think in the end it was probably worth it because I hope it made clear um, the real terms, which I think are invisible to a lot of the people in the U.S. Um, that the way this question of violence is always framed in the West is as if it's a choice. Um, you can be violent or you can be nonviolent. You should be nonviolent. You should be nonviolent. There's no excuse for being violent. And what remains unseen in that like fantastical scenario is that violence is an absolute reality for people living under occupation. It is not avoidable. You live like violence is the air, violence is the water, violence is the sky, and you have some ability to negotiate in how you react to it and how you. But there's um, this notion that violence is something you do or don't do, which is entirely in your hands. It's just a pure ideology, like pure fantasy. Um, and despite that, for decades, um, people in Palestine have been hewing to the methods of nonviolent resistance, not taking up arms. And they've done this, for a variety of reasons, um, strategic and otherwise. Um, and despite this, they've been killed, they've been brutalized, they've been tortured, etc. Um, and what we get at the end of that is uh, the absolute uniformity of violence on all sides. And that shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Um,
And so, I mean, one of the things I struggle because I haven't been to Palestine since 2009. I'm struggling to understand how livelihoods occur. UNRWA has been basically defunded and jettisoned from the country. And for in many ways, UNRWA is an employment agency, which I think is a good thing for the Palestinians who've never had the opportunity to develop an economy and in a robust country of their own. So that's out. There's the PA, which I guess funnels some money to people, and that's why that exists, the Palestinian Authority. But the accelerated confiscation of farmland, you go to these villages in the West Bank and you report on that. How are people surviving? How are they paying for bread and fuel? Like what does that look like?
I think people are really hurting, because two things have happened. One is that a huge amount of the West Bank population survives on PA salaries, many of them in the security forces, because like the U.S. vision of a functioning Palestinian state mainly meant you know guns to prevent Palestinians from asking for anything more than the facade of a state. Um, but they've only been getting, I think, 60% of their salaries for many months now, which means people are barely making it. But also, I mean, a huge sector of the West Bank's economy relied on work in Israel. And some of that was permitted. People had permits to cross through the checkpoints to, do all of the work that in the U.S. gets done by immigrants, to work in restaurants, to do construction, all the work that people who have other options don't really want to do. Um, and and then also a lot of Palestinians who didn't have permits would take the risk of sneaking over through the checkpoints, or jumping the wall, to work, under even more exploitative conditions, just like the undocumented work in the U.S. under exploitative conditions. And basically all of that has stopped since October 7th. That the no more permits were issued. Palestinians from the West Bank who were in the, sorry, my battery's about to die, who were in the, um, who were working in Israel. Did I lose you?
Mhm.
Okay, sorry. Um, had to go back and lost their jobs, and people who were working without permits we're no longer able to do that. So people I think the one sort of saving grace is that outside of the cities, people live in villages with their extended families, and people take care of each other, and people feed each other. But I think people are really suffering, and um, there's not just um, the deprivations of the moment, I think. But there's all for a lot of people little hope of escaping them, not only because it seems like this situation will never end and will only get worse, but the possibility, for instance, which was there for a lot of Palestinians, of studying abroad, and working abroad has gotten that much harder, as it's harder and harder to for people to get any kind of you know to leave. And so yeah, how do people do it? I think it's extremely difficult. Um,
So, I mean, I asked that question because I'm building to a question about Endgame here. In Gaza, it seems that the goal is the extermination of all life. I don't think I'm overstating things. I don't know if the goal will be realized in that way, but that seems to be the goal. It's the goal that's been pronounced over and over again, and the policy that's been implemented to that end seems clear. We know that there's a starvation siege. I've seen some murmuring about Israel permitting educated people and people with some means to be evacuated and to leave. And that all goes again to that end game. No more Palestinians in Gaza. Um, what's the end game in the West Bank? I mean, is this more or less the same idea? Where do you see this going? Are the Palestinians going to be hemmed into smaller and smaller territory? And then if they can't earn a living, what happens?
yeah, I mean, I think it's the West Bank is more complicated than Gaza in some ways because there are so many settlers there already, um, and the settlement enterprise has been so successful, and the settlements are so dense in much of the West Bank, that the kind of exterminatory violence that we've seen in Gaza isn't really possible. You can't carpet bomb the Nablus Valley, because there'd be the wrong kind of collateral damage. So the places where we've seen exterminatory violence have been in the parts of the West Bank that have the least settlers, right? Like so around Jenin and Tulkarm. Um, and But in the rest of the West Bank, I think what we're seeing is, they've been um, the wall, which was initially built, um, within and around the Green Line, which separates the West Bank from the 1948 boundaries of Israel. Um, and of course, shot into the West Bank at various top places to take land. Now they're talking about building walls um, in areas that are very thick with settlements to separate settlers from their Palestinian neighbors. So we're seeing a kind of Bantustans on the sort of micro level in the works. Um, and the roads that are used for settlers are being they're building new bypass roads so that settlers won't have to have any encounters with Palestinians. So I think we're seeing an acceleration of the physical reality which has been taking shape for years, in which Israeli settlers can live without seeing Palestinians on Palestinian land, basically. Um, and I think it's pretty clear that their plans are to push Palestinians out of places where they can. I mean, I think a lot of the stepped up violence in the Jordan Valley and in the South Hebron Hills, where settlers have really been completely off the leash. I think more than 50 communities have been completely abandoned because settler violence has gotten so extreme. I think that's a sign of things to come. Um, And Jordan Valley and the South Hebridean Hills again are less densely populated than other parts of the West Bank, so they can kind of do it there more easily. And that also the population in those areas is more heavily Bedouin than other parts of the West Bank, and therefore has sort of less support from the PA. Not that that means very much, but I think we're seeing this sort of intensive Bantu stanification. It's a awkward word, um, and just sort of pushing people out. I think the ultimate horizon um, is like the reason everybody's scared is because they see on the horizon a more complete degree of cleansing, um, and it's not there yet. It's visible. The shapes it's taking, the shapes that it will take, are already extremely visible, um, and at the moment, there's nothing to stop it. Not the UN, not the United States, certainly, not the European Union, not the Arab states. Um, and the possibilities for Palestinian resistance are more limited than ever. Um, this does not paint an optimistic picture, but I think that wouldn't be doing anyone much of a service if I were to do that. Um, so I think people see a horrific future on the near horizon. Um, and right now, without some major break against Israel from without, um, like I think that is the reality that's coming. It's awful to say it, but I think that's what's coming. You were saying earlier, like now we can look, you we can look back to 2009 and we can see what happened in Gaza, being prepared then. We can see um, another genocide in the future that extends to the Jordan River. And it doesn't, I'm not sure it helps us to see it, but it certainly wouldn't help us to be delusional about it. So I think,
And those are sobering words, and I can't say I disagree. I mean, in the opinion piece from 2009, you talked about a binational state, which I supported for a long time. And so I guess is my final question. Would you consider that earlier argument in light of today? What do you think of that argument?
yeah, I had always thought the one state solution was the only one that made any kind of moral sense. Um, and I think an increasing number of people were coming to that view, certainly within the West Bank. Um, for years it seemed like only within a 25-mile radius of DC and the DC suburbs did anybody still think the two-state solution was viable. But I think now the level of mistrust in the West Bank is so severe, that it's very hard to imagine within this generation people finding a way to live together. I mean, it was hard to imagine before, but now there is so much fear and so much hate um, on both sides. The October 7th attacks left a deep scar on Israelis, and they are they're acting out of fear. They're acting horrifically, but they're scared, and so it's very hard to imagine a binational a any kind of single state um, that would work at this moment. Um, it's also hard to imagine a two-state solution that would work at this moment. But but you don't bring me on your podcast to come up with policy prescriptions.
I mean, it's also dark and but I mean, it doesn't help to look away either. And so I want to express gratitude again to you, Ben Ehrenreich, for joining me today.
Thing that's maybe not so dark before we stop.
I'm sorry.
Can I say one thing that's maybe not so dark?
Yeah.
I think that like I paint this dark picture, which I think is an accurate one, to make it all the more clear to those of us who are living in relative comfort outside of Palestine, the importance of continued pressure on Israel. Because I think it can only come from outside, and everything we've talked about in terms of the corruption of American political institutions. I think that also is clear to a lot of people. And the protests that we saw in since the beginning of the genocide have been like absolutely unprecedented. Like the amount of popular outrage over what Israel is doing is like unmatched in American history, right? And I think that has to be kept up, whether Trump is in office or someone else is in office, because the only way to prevent an even more horrific reality is to end this impunity. And I think that has to happen outside of Israel and Palestine.
And I appreciate that. I mean, those are our marching orders, right? We reclaim our democratic institutions, implement policy that reflects the will of people domestically who are generally good and fair in their thinking. And then hopefully we abort the next genocide. Um, it's good to think positively.
If only at the very end of this
Ah,
conversation.
thank you, Ben Ehrenreich, for your thinking, for your writing. I look forward to your next essay. And thanks to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please check out the FMEP website where we'll post the three pieces that Ben published that we spoke about on this podcast. Um, Thanks again.
Thanks, Ahmed. Appreciate it.